Thank you for joining us tonight. We are playing a pre-event slideshow. The live logo appears in gold with the text, "Live from NYPL and the Dorothy and Louis B. Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers present The Trials of D.H. Lawrence, Francis Wilson with Andrew Motion, September 20th, 2021, 7 p.m. Eastern Time." This slide contains an image of the featured book. Black and yellow text appear on a red background. Burning Man, The Trials of D.H. Lawrence by Francis Wilson. There are black markings showing flames spread across the cover. Burning Man is available for purchase online from the library shop, on.nypl.org/shoplive. Proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Reserve a copy for free with the New York Public Library card. Visit tonight's event page to find this title in a variety of formats. nypl.org/live. The last slide shows recommended reading. Francis Wilson suggests these titles for further reading: Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence, Studies in Classic American Literature by D.H. Lawrence, Mornings in Mexico by D.H. Lawrence, The Bad Side of Books, Selected Essays of D.H. Lawrence, edited by Jeff Dyer, Lorenzo and Taus by Mabel Dodge Luhan. Check out the list on tonight's event page, nypl.org/live.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the New York Public Library. My name is Martha Hose. I'm interim director of the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the library, stepping in for Director Salvatore Schivona, who's on fellowship leave for the next 2 years. Tonight, we continue our fall 2021 Conversations from the Cullman Center, a collaboration with Live from NYPL. Please be aware that tonight's program has been pre-recorded. Cullman Center fellow Francis Wilson will discuss her new book, Burning Man, The Trials of D.H. Lawrence, in conversation with esteemed poet Andrew Motion. As you may know, the Cullman Center selects 15 fellows each year for a 9-month term. The program was founded in 1999, and to date, we've supported the work of more than 300 fellows. Fellows receive an office in the center and a living stipend so they can focus exclusively on their work. They come to the library to gain intensive access to our unparalleled collections in order to write the books of tomorrow. Our fellows are among the best and most promising academics and independent scholars, fiction writers and poets, journalists and translators, playwrights and dramatists, and artists at work today. Writers and scholars from any country are welcome to apply, and the deadline for the next group of fellows is coming right up on September 24th. Upcoming talks with Live from NYPL with Cullman Center fellows include Dash Shaw in conversation with Lauren Redness, May Nye in conversation with Eric Foner, Faith Hillis in conversation with Mike Duncan, and all of these will be live events held online. If you'd like to register for these or any of the other fantastic events at Live from NYPL, go to nypl.org/live. You can also see all of our events and everything else the library has to offer by signing up for our newsletter at nypl.org/connect. All these programs are made possible through the generosity of patrons like you. So please consider supporting the library however you can. If you have an NYPL library card or live in New York State and want to apply for one, you can borrow Burning Man for free. Or if you're able, you can buy the book from the library shop. Proceeds benefit the library. And you can also find links to buy the book on the event page at nypl.org/live. Francis Wilson has also put together a wonderful list of further reading, which you can find along with ways to access these titles from the library on the event page, again, nypl.org/live. Before I invite our guests to the screen, I have a couple of important points to share with you. First, closed captioning is available for tonight's program via the closed caption button. Second, the library values your privacy, so in the spirit of transparency, there are a few things we want you to know. Even though the video and chat are on an nypl.org page, they're hosted by YouTube. By participating in the chat, you might share data about yourself, which the library doesn't control. For more details, you can visit our frequently asked questions page along with Google's privacy policy and the library's privacy policy, all available on the event page. Now to our speakers. Frances Wilson's interlocutor this evening is Andrew Motion, the Homewood Professor of the Arts at Johns Hopkins University. He was Poet Laureate of the United Kingdom for 10 years, after which he was knighted for his service to poetry. Andrew is the co-founder of the Poetry Archive, which you can find at poetryarchive.co.uk, and served as editor of the Poetry Review. His prize-winning works include biographies of Philip Larkin and John Keats, among others, novels and autobiography, as well as many volumes of poetry, most recently, Randomly Moving Particles, published last year. He's an elected fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Andrew speaks tonight with Frances Wilson, also a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Frances was a Cullman Center Fellow in 2018-19 and is the author of many unconventional and prize-winning biographies. Among them, Guilty Thing, A Life of Thomas de Quincey, about one eccentric's obsession with Wordsworth and Coleridge, and How to Survive the Titanic, told through the lens of the dishonored owner of that doomed ship. The book under discussion this evening, Burning Man, The Trials of D.H. Lawrence, bears Wilson's signature creativity as she follows Lawrence over the course of a decade from England to Italy to New Mexico in the United States, structured by way of Dante's divine comedy journeys through hell, purgatory, and paradise. Frances and I were Cullman Center Fellows together, and I recall her saying that at the Cullman Center, she was fittingly writing the section of the book on paradise. We're proud to welcome Andrew Motion and Frances Wilson.
So Frances, by my calculations, this is your 6th book, this wonderful biography of D.H. Lawrence, and I think your 5th biography.
Yes.
And looking down the list of your previous publications, of course, I was very struck by how many of them are actually capital R romantic subjects, or by some stretch of the imagination, small r romantic subjects. Do you want to say a little bit about that and a little bit about how Lawrence fits into that? I mean, in a moment, I think we should perhaps talk about why Lawrence in particular, but just to set your interest in him, more than interest in him, against that background might be a good place to start.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. What my subjects have in common is they're all people who have written about themselves. So I'm a biographer who focuses on autobiographers, if you like. I mean, what I was drawn to in Lawrence is the fact that he is so fascinated by himself. And Thomas de Quincey was equally fascinated by himself. And of course, Dorothy Wordsworth wrote journals about herself. And so it's, and with Harriet Wilson, the courtesan, I wrote about her because she wrote memoirs. And so that's my level of engagement as a biographer is, I look at narratives that people have already constructed about themselves.
Has that led you to any kind of grand conclusions about how people do write about themselves, about how wise people are about their own personalities or unwise they are about them?
Absolutely no grand conclusions at all. Strange to say. I'm interested in people who write about themselves. Well, you're a biographer who writes about yourself. So
yes.
You're coming to this from a very different perspective to me, because I mean, I'm interested in people who write about themselves because it's the last thing I could do. I feel absolutely nothingness when I think about myself and my own story, just a kind of blank, but I'm filled with narrative when I think about other people's lives. So I think I'm fascinated by people who do have a narrative for their lives and who are constructing it all the time, and I like to kind of intervene in that.
And indeed interrogate presumably the idea of what it is to write about yourself. I mean, how much of it is, as it were, controlling, which might involve a degree of making things up in order to impose a story on what actually happened, and how much of it is simply the record of events as they pass.
Yes, that's right.
Where does Lawrence fit in with that, do you think? I mean, before we start talking about him in more detail, how self-disguising is he in his apparent revelations about himself?
Well, I'd say he wasn't self-disguising at all, except that he fantasizes about himself as a much more macho man than he really was. But his writing kicked into gear if you like. It really got up to speed when he started writing about himself in a very raw way, and that was in Sons and Lovers. And it was wonderful Miriam who said to him, his earliest muse and teenage girlfriend, it was Miriam who said to him, just tell the truth. Just tell the truth about your family. And so it's that very undisguised self that he realized was his subject. But Lawrence wrote about himself in everything. I mean, Lawrence's entire oeuvre is about what it was like to be Lawrence. I mean, even his strange history book, Movements in Modern European History, is about being Lawrence. Even his animal poems are about being Lawrence. I mean, you can't get away from Lawrence's kind of desperation to tell the world what it looks like from his perspective. Even when you're reading about Lawrence on Melville, he's talking about what it's like to be Lawrence. He's seen himself as Melville. And so he was a huge autobiographer. And also I think he was one of our first auto-fiction writers, because he didn't try to disguise that self. And he wrote about the self in the process of writing about the self.
Yes, I mean, that seems to me, I mean, you know vastly much more about him than I do, but that seems to me exactly right. I think what's interesting me about this question is how much, with the best will in the world, people who write about themselves often are, if not quite telling lies about themselves, though sometimes that happens, but are self-deceiving, whether they like it or not. I mean, do you feel there's some sort of good match between the story that Lawrence tells about himself and the story that other people tell about him?
Oh, wow, and everyone told stories about him. And
well,
so,
indeed they did.
I mean, what I was trying to do in Burning Man was to marry the story that Lawrence told about himself with the many, many stories that people told about Lawrence, because it seemed to be impossible to meet Lawrence even for half an hour without writing a memoir about him. And so, yes, I think what's interesting is the way that Lawrence saw himself. I mean, Lawrence saw himself as a much gentler person than he actually was. I mean, he writes about himself as though he were a sane person.
Right.
And as though he had no impact on anyone in a room, when people who wrote about Lawrence said that, you know, the only atmosphere in the room was Lawrence, the only person in the room was Lawrence. It was like having a fox, you know, suddenly come into a hen.
Exactly. So we had the idea of him discovering that this is his true note, to interrogate himself, to sort of amplify himself in some way as a result of early sort of personal influences. Are there writers who are helping him to do this? I mean, people that he's reading who are leading him towards this kind of self-interrogation, or is part of his originality to do with the fact that he's kind of making this up in some sense, and that he's pioneering this way of writing?
No, he was pioneering it. Early Lawrence, the first two Lawrence novels, the kind of The White Peacock and The Trespasser, were sub-hardy. I mean, he was very hardy, very interested in the kind of the pastoral early novels of George Eliot. And he didn't discover himself until he decided that, and it wasn't he who decided, it was Miriam who decided that Lawrence had to write about his class. Lawrence was the first English working class novelist. No one had described before the atmosphere of a coal miner's cottage.
Exactly.
No one had described just the tattoo of purple veins on the back of a coal miner, on a coal miner's back when he comes back from work.
Right.
Exactly. Write about what you know, because it's never been given kind of literary expressions. Yes.
That's, I mean, I was so much hoping you'd say that, I must say, and in a sense that was I was sort of reaching for in my questions, because it's an odd combination, isn't it, when he does find his true voice, of a literary determination. I mean, this stylistically, this is what I'm going to do, with an opportunity to do something in class terms that frankly has not been done before, and to bring the background of everybody else's novels into the foreground and see life from that angle.
But he was adamant that he didn't want to be seen as a working class novelist. This is what Madox Ford wanted him to be as well. When Madox Ford was the first editor, he was the editor of the English Review. He was the first editor to kind of to publish Lawrence as a very young man, and he published his early poems and some sensational early short stories like Odor of Chrysanthemums. And he said to Lawrence, you know, we want more of it. We want more of the Nottingham dialect. We want more of the kind of working class feel. And Lawrence felt, you know, like everyone, I want to get away from my family. Yes. I want to become a writer because I don't want to be a coal miner's son anymore. Yes, so he got incredibly irritated by this.
But irritation, I mean, this is taking us away from what we've begun talking about here, but it's perhaps worth saying en route that irritation is a great spur for him, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, no, he loved irritation. He lived in irritation.
Exactly.
Lawrence lived inside rage, and the rage was, it was his combustion engine. It's what.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as everything about your book tells us from the title on. Well, I just wanted to establish that as a kind of background to the other things that I might, if I may ask you about, which, as you'll very soon see, I've divided really into two sections, so they might overlap a good deal. One is sort of general questions about him, and the other is much more specific things about the organization of your book and so on and so forth. But my second general question is something that you're beginning to answer in the things that you've already said, which is why Lawrence for you now as the subject of this book. There are, I think, at least three major, quite recent biographies of Lawrence: the John Worthen books, Brenda Maddox, Anthony Burgess. I mean, I'm not quite sure what's happened to that book. It seems rather to have sort of disappeared from view.
It's been reprinted. It's just
oh, great, good. Well, that makes sense, because Lawrence is certainly, no small thanks to you in this respect, having a bit of a moment. So I expect that other people will come back out of the woodwork. But what did you set out to bring to your telling of the story, or your retelling of the story, that you felt that was not there in previous accounts?
Oh yes, it's a rich question. I mean, first of all, what interests me about Lawrence is the fact that he simply will not go away. We keep trying to get rid of Lawrence, and he keeps coming back. So he really is like a phoenix. When he described himself as a phoenix, and we just simply cannot bury the man. I mean, however silenced he's been by feminist academics, he keeps popping up again. So I was interested in the fact that, you know, people have heard of Lawrence without having read him. So he's a bit like Byron, in as much as his name is still a very strong brand.
I kept being reminded of that, or kept thinking about that parallel while I was reading your book, actually, and thinking about this, what my own answer to this question would be. But that very interestingly comes with a sort of caveat, doesn't it, that thought, which is that it's not at all clear to me who actually does read Byron now. I mean, they might be happy to read about him.
Yes.
And there is certainly a sort of glamour in the story still that people are attracted by. Do you think there's some risk of that happening to Lawrence, that he'll come to stand for certain attitudes which might not be accurately reflect the work?
I think that has happened. I think that absolutely has happened. That people think of Lawrence as someone who had something to say about sex, but no one's quite sure what it was that he had to say about sex. And at the time, no one was quite sure what it was. And I don't think Lawrence even knew what it was, but he saw himself as sexual prophet, which I think is the least interesting thing about him. And I'd say something about Lawrence and sex and sexuality in a biography of Lawrence, and this is what I thought I was going to be writing about when I started the book, but in fact it's irrelevant, and everything he says about women, especially in the later part of his life, is of so little interest to me that I just had to skim over it to get down to why Lawrence really is interesting.
Right. And so little interest because you don't agree with it, or so little interest because you just think it's kind of doesn't make sense?
Well, no, I think because actually we've absorbed it so much.
Right.
I mean, in the way that we've absorbed Freud and we've absorbed Darwin. I mean, we've absorbed now the fact that women have sexuality, and that you can write about women from the inside, and that sex scenes. I mean, Lawrence wrote sex scenes in literature. It's so normal now, but it wasn't normal when you wrote them.
Indeed.
So it's somehow what's seen as kind of risky and thrilling about Lawrence isn't there anymore. It's just a bit funny now. Quaint. Yes,
well, because it seems to our eyes and ears so over the top a lot of the time on that particular subject. I mean, however, as it were, seriously, we might take it on our account of what's important in life. And I suppose that's, I mean, I don't want to spend the next 40 minutes talking about sex with you, but given what people do have in the sort of general mind about Lawrence, we probably ought to talk about it just for this little moment anyway. But perhaps that sort of note of almost hysterical emphasis is there because he has to push against so much opposition, indifference, hushing up, etc., contemporaneously.
Well, he had something very urgent to say about the body. And this is why I think it's so important to return to Lawrence now, because I think a younger generation of readers, students today, also have something very urgent to tell us about the body. And what Lawrence was trying to say was that, we've lived in this kind of mind-body dichotomy for binary for however long, and we have never taken the intelligence of the body seriously. And as far as Lawrence was concerned, the intelligence of the body was very, very real thing.
Right.
I mean, he believed in kind of blood consciousness. He thought that whatever that means, he thought that the unconscious was literally an organ, like the liver, sitting somewhere behind the solar plexus. He thought that the body had magnets, so that he was guided by magnets, and that birds had those same magnets, which is what led them to migrate. And so he was very much in tune with his times. This is how theosophers thought.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, where are these ideas coming from? I mean, a lot of them are obviously sort of self-engendered, but he must be getting them from elsewhere.
It was mainstream Edwardian New Age.
Right.
It's interesting how much Lawrence flowed with the time. I mean, he presented himself as always against mainstream ideas, but actually in terms of his kind of radical alternative theories, he tended to think what most people thought. So he tended to think what the other hippies thought, which was that they were all theosophers. Everyone was having affairs.
Right.
All the women he knew were bisexual or lesbian.
Right.
And so Lawrence was actually very easily shocked. He wasn't the one who was shocking.
Yeah, no, I was very struck by that, again, reading your book. I mean, I remember thinking about that in the past a little bit, but struck all over again by reading your book. And of course, particularly in the context of his own marriage, where he seems reasonably sort of stay at home and almost passive, actually, but Frieda is rushing around like a dingbat from very early on.
Yes, that's right. Well, Lawrence's marriage is the heart of the whole Lawrence story. And Lawrence's marriage has to be seen in the context of Lawrence's parents' marriage, which was also the heart of the whole Lawrence story. In fact, all of Lawrence is about marriage. The novels are all about marriage, his very, very strong feelings about marriage. And I think he was Blakean. So if he had many precursors, but I think his major precursor was Blake, and the marriage of heaven and hell seemed to him to be a perfectly reasonable way to understand marriage. That and Blake also said opposition is true friendship. And so Lawrence saw marriage as a kind of opposing forces, opposing magnetic.
No progression without contraries, or whatever it is that Blake says.
Yes,
exactly.
And so his marriage with Frieda was very much because they were opposites. Lawrence was all mind and Frieda was all body, and Lawrence talked about Frieda's mindlessness as a compliment. It was a compliment to have no mind at all.
That kind of figures, doesn't it?
In his childhood, it had been his father, the coal miner, who was all body and no mind, and his mother, who was all mind and no body.
Exactly.
And this, the dynamic of the childhood home in Lawrence's life was so vital to him. It cast a kind of spell on him that he could never get rid of. And I think a lot of us are haunted by our childhoods, but to say that Lawrence was haunted is to put it mildly. And so the conflict between his parents was so tremendous, with his mother being socially aspiring. His mother was a working class woman who wanted to rise. I mean, she said we must rise in the world. And Lawrence took this idea of rising kind of literally and as a literal and also a symbolic idea. She didn't want her sons to go down the mine. She wanted her sons to be educated. And she treated her husband with derision. And Lawrence imbibed this. He was on his mother's side as a child and also treated his father as derision. And when he came with derision, and when he came to marry himself, he married someone who actually took his father's role, in as much as Frieda was this kind of large, handsome, well-built, entirely physical woman without any capacity for serious thought. And Lawrence took his mother's kind of judgmental Puritan role.
Right, that's very interesting. And not English.
Well, no, Frieda was German. And so she was living in, and obviously Lawrence liked conflict, and so he must have enjoyed the fact that Frieda was German, living in the enemy country during World War One.
Exactly.
And Frieda was also aristocratic, which was important to Lawrence because he was a terrific snob, and he did want to rise in the world.
Yes.
And he liked talking about his wife, the Baroness, whose mother was a Baroness. And Frieda was also married, which was important to Lawrence because he needed to be in an Oedipal triangle. He needed to be with a kind of married woman who was a mother herself.
Exactly.
And so Frieda left her 3 children to be with Lawrence. And this was important to Lawrence because he needed to be the favourite child, if you like. And so the psychic complexity of that relationship from Lawrence's side was immense. And on Frieda's side, there didn't seem to be any psychic complexity at all. She just was genuinely an amoral woman.
Yes, I mean, she certainly comes out of that in your book. One of the interesting things that it reminded me to think about a good deal was how vulnerable that actually makes Lawrence. I mean, it seems to me perfectly true to say that he's somebody who feeds on opposites, who needs opposition, who's kicked into life by feeling that there are tensions in his existence. But at the same time, he's somebody who knows the value of having a protected existence as well. And I'm thinking, as I say this, of what happens to be the first poem in the Penguin anthology that I have of Lawrence's poems, the famous, actually the 2 poems, the Discord in Childhood poem and the poem Piano, both of which are about kind of hiding yourself away, and how as an adult the opportunities to hide yourself away from the rough and tumble of adult life, it is very much less than he wants it to be. So he keeps putting himself in these situations of being sort of agonized by not being able to recover some of the securities of childhood that the majority of him wants to kick away.
Yes.
Would that be right, do you think?
Yes, and I think the most interesting response he had to the securities and insecurities of his childhood was to have no home.
Right.
So he decided when he left home, he was leaving the very idea of home. Right. Lawrence never had a home. He never owned a home. In the end, the house the ranch that Frieda ended up living in New Mexico was given to him by Mabel Dodge, and in exchange he gave her the original manuscript of Sons and Lovers because he didn't want to be beholden to her, and then he never lived in it anyway, but he didn't want a home. And I think it's so interesting that he chose a life as a fox,
really?
Just a fox living in dens, and he chose to live in a very, very simple way, in a way that was almost akin to a miner's cottage. He reproduced that hardship.
That's interesting. Yes.
So, sorry.
I was only sorry to keep interrupting you. So, I mean, paradoxically, you end up with a feeling that the potential comfort is not to have any, to not make yourself vulnerable in that kind of way.
Yes. I think as well that, and this became increasingly obvious the more I sort of immersed myself in Lawrence, I think he suffered from terrible claustrophobia. Anyone whose father is a coal miner, and anyone who has this sort of preternatural sense of space that Lawrence had would be claustrophobic. I mean, there was always a sense that the earth was coming down on his head.
Right.
And he was only happy, I think, not only when he was outdoors, but when he was moving outdoors. All of his terrible rages took place in a house, and he always chose to live in very, very small houses.
Fascinating.
He'd never go into a room without punching open windows, getting as much air in as possible.
Right.
And all of his fights with Frieda, which were tremendous and numerous, took place inside. The minute he was outside, he could breathe, I think, sort of literally and metaphorically. So I think the home, not wanting a home, was a kind of fear of the walls closing in. And he described during the First World War, when he was self-exiled in Cornwall, he described rereading Edgar Allan Poe's The Pit and the Pendulum, where the walls close in, as Poe puts it. And Lawrence said that this is what the whole of England felt like, that England felt like a tight room. He always described the tight atmosphere of England. So ideally for him, he needed to get to the American Southwest, because that was where the world was no longer a room. It was still asleep. It was a paradise.
What's he got in his suitcase? I mean, with all this traveling, how and in particular, how is he doing his work? Because he never stops. He never stops, and is always on the move. But it's writing.
Yes, I found this really fascinating. I thought a lot, obviously, about what he had in his suitcase, because I was trying to dig down into what it was like to be Lawrence. I think he had nothing in his suitcase. I think he had a hat and a spare pair of trousers, and in the end, he only had, didn't even have a spare pair of trousers. His manuscripts are what interest me.
Right.
Manuscripts, and I think this is what you're getting at, isn't it, Andrew? The manuscripts were kind of scattered all over the place. He was so cavalier about them, and also the way he posted his manuscripts. So he'd post off the manuscript to Kangaroo from some godforsaken post office.
I know. Your heart jumps into your mouth, doesn't it, when you read about that? You think, you fool! This thing might simply disappear.
I know, what's going to happen to it? And so these manuscripts were flying across the Atlantic, and it's amazing that nothing was lost. The postal service was extraordinary. Lawrence never kept copies of anything. He left manuscripts behind in whatever house he was living in, because he didn't value them. Once he'd finished the book, he moved on. And by the time the book had actually come out, or the essay had come out, he was a different person. He wasn't even thinking about something else, but he was actually a different version of the same man.
Very interesting. Is he, I think I know the answer to this as I asked the question, but is he at all preoccupied by the materials that he's using to write on? Are these manuscripts such as survive? Are they on different kinds of pieces of paper, and are they all written in different sorts of pens? And he just uses what's to hand, does he?
He tended to use a kind of a yellow lined pad.
Right.
The pages folded over. He always wrote outside. There are wonderful photographs of him writing outside. Of course, he wrote outside. He had no such thing as a study, because a study would suggest he was a different kind of writer. He wanted to present writing as just a normal work activity, like washing a floor or painting a wall. And he always did that as well. He did all the housework.
Right.
You don't know your own floor until you've washed it. And he grew It's true. I love housework too, so I really identify, and you do as well.
Perfect match.
So I really identified with and appreciated the fact that he saw writing as an important act of living, like cooking and like sewing,
but not pretentiously.
No,
above those things, exactly.
No, and he didn't need a study to be soundproofed or anything for him.
Right.
No, it was Frieda who lay around in bed all day smoking her cigarettes, and Lawrence brought her food up. He tended for peace. He tended to write outside, and he would lean up against a tree trunk or a rock, bring his knees up and place the pad against his knees. And then with his incredibly neat hand, a hand that was as neat as kind of a medieval scribe's hand, really? He would just write.
Yeah. Like
real writers did, just write the story out. Very, very few changes.
Fascinating. Though, of course, a lot does get revised later on, but well, in the early novels it does, doesn't it?
Never, like as with Wordsworth, the revisions were never a good idea.
Yeah.
He got it right the first time round.
Yeah, fascinating.
And then ruined it.
Yeah, shouldn't have blotted a line, etc.
Yes.
Frances, can I just step back a little bit to what we were saying about theosophy and so on, because I wanted to ask you a little bit about him and Bloomsbury and him as a modernist. In fact, I mean, you've been talking about his originality, his pioneering interest and emphases and so on. But as we were talking about that, we were saying that these things never quite come out of nowhere, that there's always somebody or some body of people whispering things in your ear. Given his aggressions and prickliness and so on, it's not very surprising to find in your book him having rather difficult relations with the better formed literary groups around him. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I think again, we have to position Lawrence in his class and think
Right.
about the Bloomsburys, and they were aristocratic or upper middle class. Right. These people, Bertrand Russell and Virginia Woolf and Lady Ottoline Morell, right, and people like Aldous Huxley had never met a working class man before. I mean, they were aware that they existed because they had servants, but to have one in their room with right. them, to whom they had to speak as an equal, right. was really challenging. Yeah. And Lawrence was very, very aware of being patronized. Yeah. And part of, I think, one of the main reasons Lawrence kind of put all his friends into his books, like throwing them into the inferno, that he betrayed people by putting them in his books, was because he felt so patronized. He didn't want to be beholden to right. This bunch of people who he knew were kind of thinking, God, he must be a genius. He saw the term genius as condescending, because of course he must be a genius because he wasn't educated like the rest. Exactly. So therefore, it must kind of come out of nowhere. And he was fantastically well educated. Yeah. Man, he went to grammar school on a scholarship. He'd read more than most people. Yeah. Ford Madox said he'd read more deeply into the dullnesses of the 18th and 19th century than anyone else he'd ever known.
I forgot about that. Very good.
It's wonderful. So Lawrence felt that when he didn't fit in with European modernism, with British modernism, he didn't fit into anywhere. And to see him as a modernist it's complex, because I'd say in terms of his poetry, he was a modernist. Right. In terms of his novels, he was mining an old tradition, but throwing the body into it, but throwing the experience of the body into it. He talks about doing exciting things with the novel. He talks about the novel being like a bomb. He wanted it to be incendiary, but his novels were never, I think, as radical as he wanted them to be, and they got less and less good. But the poetry, I think, really was radical. But his mentor was Whitman.
You hear it in virtually every line. I mean, well, after some of the early poems, which are more sort of lyrically, as it were, well organized, or organized on the old model, but as soon as Whitman gets into his system, he never gets out of it again, does he? Yes. I mean, I'm going to sit on that thought, if I may, for a little bit, because I want to come back and talk later a little bit more about the poems, but that feels absolutely right to me. You were saying that's very helpful about Bloomsbury and all, thank you. And also, of course, very good to be reminded through all that about the emphasis on the working class, the kind of pioneering novelty of speaking in such depth and with such intimate knowledge about all that, when a lot of his readers, let alone most of his contemporary writers, thought, if they thought at all about these things, as a sort of brief visit from Leonard Bast in Howard's End. And if you put Leonard Bast in your mind next to Lawrence's characters, you see what an enormous stride he's taken towards describing the world that we know is the real one, as it were. Yes. But when he was saying all this, and in different contexts too, we were saying a little bit about how there's some danger of the novels going off the boil as they continue to appear. There's some danger of them not being read so much now. I don't know what happens in university English departments about the teaching of Lawrence, but here at Johns Hopkins, I don't think he's taught very much, and my suspicion is that that's probably quite a general position. What is the center of the work for you? Or is it more a question of selecting the undoubtedly brilliant things that appear in all forms? I mean, if I can just, as a rider to that, say that I recently read his book about, not for the first time, but for the first time for a long time, about American writing, and I was absolutely dazzled by it. I thought it was astoundingly good. And yes. And written before he even got here, I mean, so it's an amazing sort of reach as well as everything else. And a lot of what he says about Whitman et al. Stands up extraordinarily well, I think. So, yes. And I've always loved his poems, I must say, but we'll come back to those. What's the center of the target for you?
Well, one of the things I wanted to do in this book was to rearrange the Lawrence canon, and that the canon has been organised by F.R. Leavis, who I think has done an enormous amount of damage. Right. The F.R. Leavis's championing of Lawrence was a kind of quarterizing of Lawrence. Right. So F.R. Leavis's book about Lawrence was called D.H. Lawrence, novelist, but it wasn't
Yes.
only novelist, it was just 3 novels, the 3 novels that mattered: Sons and Lovers and The Rainbow and Women in Life. And then he talked about those novels as having this thing he called life in them, this kind of apple crunching life, which I don't think meant anything to anyone at the time, and it dated Lawrence a great deal. But I think there are interesting things undoubtedly in the novels. I think Sons and Lovers is a work of genius. I'm very interested in The Rainbow. But I think the other novels haven't kept their place in the canon. They haven't earned it. They should be in the periphery. And we should put all those marginalized works of Lawrence bang in the center. I think that university departments all over America should focus on studies in classic American literature as a work, as you say, of absolute genius. And it's electrifying. Your hair stands on end, doesn't it? So it's so thrilling. It's so thrilling. And he's writing about, no one had written about Melville before Lawrence. He kind of invented Melville. And the strange random texts he picks up in it, because he's writing the book, writing the first draft of the essays during the war, when he's living in exile in a Cornish cottage, very like a miner's cottage. He's got basically no books, and so he's sending for books from London, reading them, dreaming about America. So the first draft of Studies in Classic American Literature was about a country that he had never been to and that he thought would be his paradise. And he talks all the way through about Melville getting stuck in purgatory, needing to find his paradise. It's about his journey to get to America. When he gets to America, in the third part of the book, of my book, he's so profoundly disappointed by what he finds, because it was in Lawrence's nature to always be disappointed by everywhere he went. Yet he needs it. He completely rewrote Studies in Classic American Literature, talking about America as a disappointing country, as a disappointing paradise, as paradise lost. Like. And he wrote damning essays. He'd gone off Hawthorne by then, and he'd gone off Whitman by then.
Well, that speaks very, very loudly to your earlier point about each book being a sort of reinvention of himself, doesn't it? Or a sloughing of skin or something. I mean, a continual journeying on to being the next version of himself. And I think, I mean, just to turn from that to saying a little bit about the poems, that seems to me to describe quite well how the poems have their effect, which is to say that this long Whitman-esque line that he characteristically uses involves a tremendous amount of circling of sometimes quite a few ideas, representing them, putting them in a different context, as though there is some notion of an absolute truth to be got at in the writing of each of these poems, but that it's constantly slipping between his fingers. So he's constantly having to kind of renegotiate his relationship with it. I was thinking about his inheritors, if there are any in this context too, and thinking about Ted Hughes, who seems to me, in his Yorkshire way, adapts a great many of the characteristics of Lawrence's sound world, in particular, very often through using a Whitmanish long line, and also, and perhaps more surprisingly, of Larkin. Larkin revered Lawrence, in fact, allowed himself to think that Larkin might have in some sense given himself some help in discovering his own voice by reading Lawrence. I was looking at Larkin's Letters to Monica volume a couple of days ago, thinking about what we were going to say today, and just seeing what he said to Monica about Lawrence. And in one of the letters, he describes Lawrence's writing as so enormous, so shifty, so deceptive, fascinating, and evanescent. So enormous, so shifty, so deceptive, fascinating, and evanescent. And actually, almost all the things that you and I have just been saying are reflected in that remark. I think the evanescence in the need to move on, the fascination speaks for itself, the deceptiveness in what we were saying about presenting an idea of a self which is stable, but also somehow slips between our fingers, so constantly needs to be reworked. Shiftiness, that I'm not quite sure where that comes in, but in a way it's the most interesting word in the list, isn't it? Because it implies something about deceptions and enormous, well, sure, and there's just an enormous amount of it. So Are there other writers, contemporary writers, who you think owe debts to him? In other words, where does the stream go?
Yes, an awful lot of novelists. I can't think of poets who have acknowledged Lawrence in the way that Larkin and Hughes have.
Right.
But novelists always acknowledge Lawrence. Look, Rachel Cusk, for example.
Yeah, no question.
I mean, it's quite serendipitous
Yes.
experience that was for both her and me, writing about Mabel Dodge at the same time.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, it is weird how these things occur, isn't it?
So strange that it's in the air. Well, Lawrence would say it's not strange at all because it's in the air, and he'd have meant that usually.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
But but I think what writers like Rachel Cusk have taken from Lawrence is the writing about the self.
Right.
The seeing the self as the sense. Of course, you write about yourself. What else have you got to write about?
Sure.
And you write about yourself in this kind of absolutely mercilessly kind of cold-eyed way. Yeah. And writing is art for my sake.
Right.
You don't even attempt to try and say something wise about other people. You are the central intelligence of your work.
Quite. Yes, I mean the whole project, if that's quite the word for it, of autofiction or whatever we're going to call it, does have Lawrence in the background in a way that your book very valuably acknowledges, I think, because it's the credit is usually given to more recent examples of that vein in writing. Sebald in particular gets a lot of the credit, and not wrongly, for having triggered what is the sort of style de nos jours, really. But it's very good to have Lawrence there in the story as well, I think, as a kind of grandfather of it all, in a sense.
Yes.
There is another and completely different sort of writer that I wanted to mention, and I ought to have done earlier, because part of the genius of your own book has to do with the way that it structures itself around ideas to do with Dante. Can you describe for us how that works in the book?
Yes. Well, the structure of the book evolved very organically. That I started off just writing a straightforward book about Lawrence's middle years. I only wanted to focus on Lawrence's middle years, the years between 1915, when the rainbow was banned and then publicly burnt, and 1925, when he left America, having had his diagnosis of tuberculosis. So I wanted to write about those middle years, and obviously the analogy with Dante is there, that the Divine Comedy is about someone being lost in the middle of their lives, but that hadn't sort of struck me then. The more deeply I read into Lawrence, the more it occurred to me that Dante was there for him. Right. Now, Dante was there for all the modernists. Of course, Pound was preoccupied with Dante. Eliot said the world is divided between Shakespeare and Dante, divide the world between them. For Lawrence, there's no Shakespeare in Lawrence at all. It's as if he'd never read Shakespeare. There's no mention of Shakespeare.
Isn't it extraordinary?
Strangest thing, that he's saturated in Dante. And they've got, of course, Lawrence knew Dante as much as he knew the Bible, which was inside out, because everyone knew Dante, because Dante wasn't seen as this rarefied, inaccessible poet.
Exactly.
No one's read Dante now. Everyone read Dante then. And so the more I looked at the shape of Lawrence's life, the more I thought, God, it is remarkable that his journey is Dante's journey. He starts off in the underworld. He talks about his father as an inhabitant of the underworld, and he lived in the overworld, as he called it, the upper world, the overworld with the women folk. But all the men went down to the inferno every morning, and of course, as coal miners, it was literally an inferno. They were generating fire. And then Lawrence, because he was tubercular, found himself moving not horizontally across the world, but vertically, because he was trying to get to a higher and higher and higher place, because he was looking for air, because he was dying. He was born dying. And so his journey was kind of upwards. Now, I've said that his mother talked about the family had to rise. And so there was this sense of kind of social rising There was also the need to ascend. If you were tubercular, you need to find your magic mountain. But there was also deeply for Lawrence a sense of symbolic movement, because Lawrence thought in symbols, and this was the biggest challenge as his biographer. And this is what I thought that you asked earlier, Andrew, about the pre-existing lives of Lawrence. I felt that they didn't, for me, get inside. They didn't write about Lawrence from the inside, write about what it was like to be Lawrence and to think as Lawrence thought. Now, Lawrence thought in symbols. It's very, very hard for someone who doesn't think in symbols to understand what that might mean. But this was a man who gave himself the symbol of the phoenix. Who does that? Yes. Who says, okay, I've got myself a symbol, and shows it, but this is my symbol. And he put it at the bottom of all his letters. It was on the letterhead. And of course, what he meant by the symbol was that it was a mythical bird. He saw himself as a mythical figure. He identified not with other human beings. He identified either with animals and birds, or with Christ, with David and Goliath, with Dante, with the great god Pan. He saw himself as someone who was kind of semi-divine, like semi-human, semi-divine. And I think he took this aspect of himself very, very seriously, especially as he started to look more and more like Christ. And so the structure,
we know.
So the structure the book kind of fell into was Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise, because this seemed to be the journey that Lawrence was making. He described the Great War as an inferno. It was his inferno. He didn't, obviously the soldiers in the trenches were in an inferno of their own, but Lawrence, who didn't fight because he was tubercular, saw the war as an affront to him. So it was his inferno, and he used that term again and again, saying, how do we get out of this inferno, this country that had become a hell for him.
Right.
And then when he got to Italy, the middle part of the book is Lawrence in Italy. I have him in 3 different countries, in England, Italy, and then America. He saw Italy as a state of purgatory, because you cleanse yourself of your former self. But this is also what Pound said about the war. Pound said after the war, the whole of Europe was in a state of purgatory. So again, Lawrence was kind of picking up on what was in the air. And he talked about America only as paradise. I mean, the term is so ubiquitous.
Right.
He had to get to his paradise.
Yes.
And when he finally got there, he said, but this is, paradise is so disappointing. And of course, the irony was that paradise was so disappointing for Dante as well, because all the energy of the Divine Comedy, as we know, goes in the Inferno.
Absolutely.
He throws all his friends into the Inferno and watches them suffer, which is what Lawrence did with all his friends. He put them all in his novels and watched them suffer. And then by the time Dante gets to paradise, there's nothing to look at, and nothing.
Well, hardship, like the devil, has a lot of the best tunes, doesn't it? So
yeah, that's right. And what Lawrence felt when he got to America was that it was a country that was already being turned into a Hollywood film. And he arrived in America just in the same year that the Hollywood sign went up.
I'm very struck by that. It's so interesting, I think.
And he said that he wanted to see authentic Native Americans, but what he found was he said it was like cowboys and Indians in a film. And he said everything he saw had the flatness of cinema. And I went back and had a look at what Dante says about paradise, and it's a one-dimensional flatness. The world has just become abstract. And Lawrence described America as abstract. It was like cinema paradiso, if you like. And he never lost that sense of America being a kind of simulacrum of itself.
Well, that's so fascinating. And it brings us towards the end of his story, thinking about America, towards the end of his life. But of course, to say that begs a question, the question being the extent to which Lawrence spent the whole of his life with a very clear view of his own death. I mean, that apart from the fact that it must have crucially shaped absolutely everything that he did, thought, etc., from the adolescence onwards, let's close, if we may, by saying a little bit about the circumstances of his death. So he goes to New Mexico, then he goes away from New Mexico, then he goes back again to New Mexico, and there's a tremendous amount of sort of, even by his own standards, sort of accelerated traveling towards the end of his life, isn't there? A sort of terminal restlessness, as though the phoenix, which has made such a good job of being reborn on countless previous occasions, is beginning to realize that that process can't continue indefinitely. Is that how you see it, do you think?
Yes, I think we have to understand that Lawrence almost died every year.
Right.
So at Christmas, he always described it as, you know, a little bit of a cold at Christmas, but it was so severe. When you look at the letters, you know, he was in bed every Christmas for 3 months in a terrible state, barely being able to breathe.
Well,
and
the quarter of the year, you know, I mean, that's an extraordinary amount of illness in a life.
So it's an enormous amount of illness in a life. And of course, look at the hardship of his life. When he was living in the Rocky Mountains, you know, the only way they could get water was by breaking ice outside. And so he lived in, you know, his weak body suffered terrific hardship. And he was, as you say, he was ill for a quarter, half of his life. By Easter, by every Easter, he had recovered. And you can see this movement in his letters, you know, that as the weather gets warmer, he recovers. Of course, Lawrence thought this was fantastically symbolic, you know, that he rose at Easter like Christ, yes, and then stories about this, Christ has risen, you know, and so he saw himself as increasingly this pagan Christ figure. So by the time it came to actually dying, he didn't know that this, I think, was the real thing, because he'd been dying forever. And even as he lay on his deathbed in France, he was in Vence in the south of France.
Yes,
he was writing to Mabel Dodge in America saying, I will come back. And he was reading a biography of Columbus, thinking, I'm going to rediscover America again.
Right.
And then the last line he ever wrote in a letter to the Huxleys was, this place no good.
So he's getting ready to pack again and set off,
yes.
Pick up the suitcase one more time. Tell us, if it's not too gruesome a way for us to end, what happens finally, what happens to the ashes?
Oh, it's a crazy story, but it could only happen to Lawrence. You know, and of course, it's very funny that it's a story about ashes, because the phoenix rises from its own ashes.
Exactly.
So the fact that Lawrence had a kind of comedy of ashes. Yeah, so Lawrence died in Vence, and he was buried in a graveyard in Vence. And Frieda, who had already found herself her third husband, a handsome Italian captain, married him and went back to live in New Mexico, in the ranch in New Mexico. And 5 years later, she decided that she wanted Lawrence's ashes to be brought over and buried in and put in an adobe chapel that she'd had built to look like the Palace of Athena, or something, actually a public lavatory. But it was at the highest possible point. So this would be the end of Lawrence's journey. He started in the underworld. He'd end up the highest possible points in his life. It was 8,000 feet above sea level. She sends her new husband off to get the ashes. And I think, like any new husband would feel, he thought, I don't really much want to do this. He has Lawrence exhumed, the body is cremated, you know, he's got the ashes, and then he admitted years later that he'd just thrown the ashes away and brought over with him an empty urn, which he then in America, when he got to America, filled with kind of, you know, cigarette ash or something, which he then took back to Frieda. It was lost on the way so many times, it was forgotten, it was mislaid. Once the ashes were there, the three women in Lawrence's life, Mabel Dodge and Brett and Frieda, all disagreed about what should happen to the ashes. Mabel Dodge and Brett thought the ashes should be quite rightly scattered to the wind. Frieda thought they should be put in the public lavatory. She then got so angry with them that she got her husbands to stir them into the cement, she said, and daub the ashes onto the outside of the Athena public lavatory. But in fact, what I found out from friends who were in the know in New Mexico was that the three women all sat down and ate him. So they scattered the ashes on their food and ate him, which is perfect. That is exactly what Lawrence would have loved, because he goes back into the body and into the woman's body.
Exactly. And it is a sort of communion. I mean, there's a sort of weird Christ-like aspect to all that too, isn't there? as though he's become a communion wafer.
The Eucharist, taking the
Yes,
Eucharist.
exactly. Well, that's a very gruesome place to end, but I wanted you to tell us about that, because it is such an extraordinary story, and it's also one which, as you're rightly saying, picks up so much in the preceding, as it were, chapters of his life, and becomes, for somebody who lives in symbols to the extent that he does, to have such a highly symbolized denouement is completely apt, it seems to me.
It's perfect. Yes.
Francis, I'm very sorry to say that we've run out of time, but thank you so much. And while I'm here and I've got the attention of whoever's listening to this, I can't praise your book highly enough, and everybody who's listening to this and thousands who are not listening to it should go and buy it immediately. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us tonight. We are playing closing slides. Burning Man is available for purchase online from the library shop, on.nypl.org/shoplive. Proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Reserve a copy for free with the New York Public Library card. Visit tonight's event page to find this title in a variety of formats, nypl.org/live. This slide shows live from NYPL upcoming events. Monday, September 22nd, 1 p.m., virtual program. Returning from Extremism, Carla Power with Wajahat Ali. Wednesday, September 29th, 6:30 p.m., virtual program. Climate Change, The Case for Hope and Healing, Catherine Hayhoe with Tia Nelson. Wednesday, October 6th, 7 p.m., virtual program. Drawing Silence, Dash Shaw with Lauren Redness, co-presented with the Dorothy and Louis B. Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers. For more information and to register, visit nypl.org/live.